I warmly welcome on our today's meeting. As the topic shows, it is a meeting especially for teaching staff. However, if anyone is interested in this topic, I invite you to listen and take something for yourself. My name is Monika Kujawska-Walkowiak, and I'm psychologist who works in education from the beginning of my work. From a few years, I'm also a systemic psychotherapist, positive psychotherapist, and a trauma pedagogue on my way to certificate. I combine these two works, work at school and therapeutic work. I thought it's a good idea to meet with you here and share with you some psychoeducational piece. The reality that surrounds us is for most of us the new challenge. Till that time, the war, migration, refugees was something far away, and today it's our everyday life. And I'm sure this will be just a part of knowledge I will share with you. But despite this multi-level that we should consider talking about trauma, I hope I will manage to share with you some information. We'll start from the definition of the trauma. I have a feeling that this word is now in everyday language, and we got lost what we think about when we say that somebody is traumatized, somebody has a trauma. And I think it's very important to be precise here so that this word will not lose its power. Sometimes we hear students who say, I have so trauma because I've got maths today. We'll not talk about this kind of trauma today, and I would like to make this deeper. Word trauma comes from a Greek language, and it means injury or wound. And medically, it would be easy to explain because it would be an injury of a body part. But we, talking today about trauma, will think about injury or wound, but in a psychological context. So we'll actually talk about psychotrauma. Here you've got definition that has many elements of a trauma. First is what I told, mental injury. Where it comes from, the same as with physical wound, something must have caused it. So we have external factor, stressor, experience that is much stronger than everyday experiences, and this is an event that puts life or health of a person or the close ones to that person in danger. Important thing in this definition is that trauma is natural defense reaction of an organism. So in that event in which we were, we couldn't do for us anything better than this reaction in this very specific way, with changes in our thinking, in our emotions. We'll talk about it later. So, talking about trauma, we have element of injury, we have defense reaction in response to that event. It can be short, but it can also last in time. And it is event very important event for us and is connected with huge suffering. When we talk about stressors, this traumatic, I have plenty of them here. It's written in that slide. The things connected with a person as a factor, but also things that we cannot influence on. So these environmental factors. If we would like to make the whole list of stressors, it would be not possible, because for everyone this element that can cause trauma symptoms would be something different. That means that the same situation for each of us will mean something different. In one person it will activate this trauma reaction, in another person it will not. We'll also say something about factors that can influence on whether we experience trauma or not. Apart from that element, I put here what is our actual stressor now. So migration, refugees, and war. These are the elements that we are meeting with in everyday life. War trauma is doubtless one of the strongest stressors, and it's connected with a lot of death, cruelty, and the fear of life and health of self and others. And as you remember, this fear about life and health was one of the key elements of trauma. A bit of statistics. I told that there are many elements that can cause trauma, and it is really like that not many of us will not experience any traumatic event during lifetime. Here statistics say that 70 to 90% will experience a traumatic event. Among these people, in about 10%, post-traumatic reaction can occur. This probability of trauma occurrence increases when the factor responsible for trauma is a person. When we talk about these factors, the human factor and this environmental natural factor, more people are traumatized when this factor was another person. How can we react? What is going on? There is a situation, it affects us, and in which area, what changes.
Pogrupować to i jakoś tak uprościć do 4
For the needs of our today's meeting, I tried to group it and simplify to 4 areas
zmiany, które zachodzą na płaszczyźnie naszych emocji.
That are connected in the context of school with children and adolescents. And here the changes that happen on the level of our emotions. It's feeling of helplessness, emptiness. Sometimes one emotion covers the other one. So child shows us sadness, but underneath there is anger because he or she can't do it other way at that moment. Here's also a feel of guilt, loneliness, depressive states. In our thoughts, at that moment of experiencing trauma, there is chaos. We're not able to think, to connect. We have problems with concentration. And often what is going on around us seems to us like a movie, like we are not the creators but the observers of our life. On the level of body, a lot of somatic symptoms. Some of them are known to us from a simple stress situation. But when we talk about trauma, it's much stronger and deeper. So it's definitely not a pleasure for us. And we've got behaviors, because what we feel, what we think, has influence on how we act. When we are people who have no feeling of self-agency, influence, having a feeling of senseless, have difficulties with thinking, we are confused. Often aggression appears in our behavior as a defense mechanism. This is how we are dealing. And I could stop on these 4 spheres, but it is not that simple in trauma. I prepared some non-specific symptoms with which teacher can have a contact in class. Among the youngest children, we can observe regress in development. So we can see behaviors that are not typical for their age. It could be returns till finger sucking. For example, it is specific for these youngest children. But when we think about a bit older children in the school age, so here very important is the situation in which they can start to think that they are guilt, that this is their responsibility, what is going on. They can have fears. feeling of loneliness.
Jak wiemy, grupa bardzo specyficzna, jeżeli chodzi o rozwój podstawowy, a co dopiero
But they can go into the role connected with the responsibility for others.
czyli tutaj
Teenagers
może dojść do sytuacji,
are a very specific group, as we all know,
osoby
when it comes about that basic development.
przekonanie o swojej
And it's much more specific when trauma
chociaż
experience is added.
jest podstawowym
It can happen
spędzania czasu.
that they will stop feel anything in order to protect themselves. They will feel very different. They will not
Czyli wszystkie te zachowania
make relations with their peers, although it's age in which a group is their basic environment.
edukacyjne, myślę, że
Risky behaviors may occur.
byłyby takie bardzo podstawowe.
Psychoactive substances use
I dlatego ten slajd, który
all these behaviors that we would like
emocji,
to
myślenia,
avoid.
zachowania są zmiany, które zachodzą
And
na
that's
poziomie biologicznym.
on educational level. These symptoms would be very basic, but they come from somewhere. And that's why I put this slide that shows that on the basis of emotions and behavior, there are changes on the level of biology,
Rzeczywiście ilość połączeń
changes that happen in our nervous system, immune system, our brain, with our memory.
który to niweluje.
There are some researches and evidence
I przy pomocy oddziaływań terapeutycznych i
that show that during stressful situation, the amount of connections in our brain
co się dzieje w tej naszej
decrease.
w związku z
Gratefully, we have a mechanism that protects us from that is neuroplasticity, and using therapeutic and supporting influences, we can withdraw that process.
ale wśród tych, które
What happens
rzeczywiście tej traumy doświadczą, możemy wyróżnić sobie
due to the situation that is traumatic for us? How we can react on that? We told that not all people who will experience difficult event will be traumatized, but among these who will experience the trauma, we can differentiate 4 ways of resolving and going out of this situation. The largest group is the group of people who will return back to health after this traumatic event. So they will use their resilience,
nie będzie to łatwe.
they will build it or support it, and thanks to that,
Urazami
they will come back
doprowadzić do wystąpienia
to the level of functioning that they had before traumatic event. Another group will survive that time. It will be not easy,
podda się i
but they will go out of that hurt with wounds that can lead
też
to
tą grupę
complex
osób
to PTSD.
nastąpić tak zwany posttraumatyczny
There will also be a group that will give up, and among that people, PTSD will be strong consequence of trauma. But we also have the 4th group, and that is the group in which post-traumatic growth can occur. It's good to listen to that, and it would be very nice if it would be like we go through difficult experiences and we not come back to that level before, but we gain new resources, we react emotionally better than it was before trauma. And of course, it can happen like that, and there are people who experience post-traumatic growth, but it's also connected with suffering. So it is not a way to our well-being. Statistically, it would be the same amount of people who have injury leading to PTSD and those who gave up. The largest group would be those who return to the level before the trauma, and the single people will experience post-traumatic growth. This level of stress that accompany a trauma is connected with losing of control and feeling of helpless and having no influence on anything, and that leads to disintegration of life, changes which are illness, changes in personality and mental illness. But which factors will decide whether we will experience PTSD or not? Here we have again a lot of factors. We have no influence on the power of the stressor, but we have influence on our resources, on how we take care of ourselves and how we support ourselves in everyday life, how we perceive what is around us. What were our earlier experiences and how we survived the earlier difficult situations? Do we have family support? Do we have social support? How well our personality is integrated? And from these things, a lot we have influence on. Will not have influence on these two last elements, on physiology and our genetic predispositions. It's because during our development there are many processes that are unconscious. Thanks to them we live, we walk, we breathe, but we are not conscious about them till they are broken. So, for example, when we have a problem with a smaller volume of hippocampus, this is a factor that makes us more vulnerable to trauma. It's the same with the level of hormones. And also, if there is a damage in the structure of prefrontal cortex. These are things that we have no influence on. According to researchers, there are many factors that tell that we can experience PTSD. Among these factors, there is age. The older a person is, the more vulnerable to PTSD. More often, the stress is among women. The kind of trauma and whether it's our first situation or there were many situations. There's also factor connected with our social status, religiousness, our level of environmental support. This all will help us or make it more difficult for us in dealing with trauma. Here, I would like to encourage you and maybe share with some of you some concepts that explain how the brain will work in stressful situations. We could use medical language here, the names of the structures of a brain, but in trauma pedagogics and in the process of working with trauma, one of the most important elements is psychoeducation. People who experience trauma are confused, and that's why the knowledge why they behave this way helps them in their healing process. And I would like to say about 3 approaches who actually are concerned around one model of a brain, triple model of a brain that takes part in trauma. First concept is the brain of reptile, the brain of cat, and the brain of professor. And that says that the brain of each person is composed of 3 parts. The oldest in evolution is this reptile part. It is brainstem, and it's called reptile because reptiles also have this part. And that part manages the most basic areas such as breathing, heart rate, eating, bowel movements, and still that reptile part is a central of reflexes such as cough, sneezing. It's co-responsible for sleep and waking up. So actually all these very basic activities
najważniejsza, tak? Przytulanie, głaskanie,
The second part
ta część mózgu
is cat brain.
śródmózgowie, jak
This is the brain that is connected with emotions. You can imagine a cat lying in front of the fireplace who really wants pleasure. And that part of the brain, midbrain, is between brain and the brainstem and is responsible for all these vegetative tasks. So it is responsible for creation and managing of feelings, for memorizing. Is also a memory center. Here we talk mostly about hippocampus and the limbic system. And the third part, this professor brain, it's the youngest part of our brain, evolutionary. This reptile part is developed actually in fetal life. This cat part is developing to 6 years old, and then till 25 years old this professor's brain develops. This brain is the most developed part of the brain, and it's center of I. It consists of cortex, which is divided into sensoric part, motoric fields, and fields connected with thinking and memorizing. Both hemispheres of cortex, so this professor part, are specialized on doing certain tasks. One is connected with speech and logic. This is usually the left side, and this on the right side are responsible for creativity and the sense of order. And in normal situation, these three elements of the brain, so this reptile, cat, and professor's brain, cooperate with each other. It's like the reptile is taking rest, and the cat's brain cooperates with a professor's brain. In traumatic situation, that reptile is waking up and starts to be the chieftain. Emergency mode is on. The brain stem makes the whole body tense and mobilized. Adrenaline levels are up, and that's the state that enables escape at any time. So it is mobilization of our organism to escape. The reptile brain affects the cat's brain by disturbing its working, by limiting the memorizing functions, consciousness, and emotional control. Because these are what the cat's brain is responsible for. reptile brain affects also professor's brain. All thoughts are reprogrammed on mode danger. And it happens even if it's not logical. In the brain, there's also some kind of fuse, and it becomes overheated then. After trauma, emergency mode is usually turned off and it goes back to normal mode. But if this switch won't work, there's life-threatening situation. There's no possibility to escape. The fight is not possible, and the person is helpless and becomes frozen, cannot move. And that state can cause PTSD. In this stress, the symptoms that will most often occur will be psychomotoric agitation, fear, problems with sleep, but we'll also have dissociative changes as avoidant behavior. We will try consciously to avoid some thoughts, talks, will avoid certain activities, situations, or we will belittle what is going on around us. Sometimes we may experience flashbacks that can be smells, sounds, and we can re-experience trauma. The second concept, which is similar to this about reptile cat and professor's brain, this is the concept of brain on the hand, and we can use it to explain the older children what is going on with them. The wrist will be this reptile part. Here we would have amygdala, responsible for emotions, and when we close hand, we'll have cortex. Nails also play a role here. You can read it. I go a bit faster because we're running out of time. There's also another way of explanation of brain functioning. It's a film. I hope Agnieszka will put a link on chat. This is in English. So if you use English translation, you will not need it during that film. But even those who don't speak English will probably understand it, because it's for children, for young children. It's simple. In the meantime, when I was talking about functioning of the brain in trauma situation, I used that organism is mobilized to fight, flight, or is frozen, because these are three possible reactions.
Mechanizm ucieczki i walki bardzo często będzie pojawiał się w sytuacji stresowej.
The mechanism of fight and flight will often occur in stressful situation, but not that strong. and this freeze reaction will accompany trauma. To sum up, I would like to share a few informations worth to remember. About 80% of us will experience traumatic event. Not each of these events will cause trauma. That's a good news. Trauma is natural defense reaction for a situation that is not normal, and that helps us to survive in these conditions. That's the best thing we can do at that time. On which areas will experience trauma? Will it be more area of emotions or thoughts or behaviors? It's very individual. And it's not like all people in trauma react in the same way. We have some lists of symptoms, but in each person the proportions can be different. Some symptoms may appear straight after difficult event, but some symptoms may last for a very long time, even if that event has already ended. And that is one of the criteria of PTSD. If the symptoms last for 6 months, that is a signal that it can be PTSD. About intensity, I've already told. And the best news: we can deal with traumatic experiences. There's a hope. We have a lot of methods and ways that counteract the trauma. It can be done by teachers in school. However, if the symptoms will be very deep and strong, there will be dissociation and the other symptoms I've told about, then I would encourage you to contact with a specialist, with a psychologist, psychotherapist, and his task would be stabilization, confrontation, integration of these separated parts of the brain, and that will help to recover. For those who survived, on Friday at 9 p.m. after a week of work, I've got a gift. You can download. Agnieszka probably put the files on chat. The Center of the Therapy Dialogue prepared booklets in Polish and Ukrainian about trauma. These are written using simple language and explain what is going on during trauma. So if you are interested, I invite you to read these booklets. At the end of this meeting, I hope you found here something that will be useful for you and that it was not boring for you. Thank you very much for today.